Within the Old Testament, there is a narrative that stands out as, quite frankly, one of the most deeply disturbing accounts in all of Scripture. There are those who might go so far as to describe it as the single most horrifying event recorded in the Bible. This particular series of events is documented in the book of Judges, spanning chapters 19 through 21. While chapter 19 is somewhat well known, very few people take the time to read all the way through to the conclusion of this account. Despite how unsettling this story is, I am convinced that it contains significant lessons we must carefully consider and learn from. To begin, let us delve deeply into this narrative, examining it in a comprehensive and vivid manner before reflecting on the crucial insights and lessons it has to offer. Now let's turn our attention to Judges chapter 19, starting with the first verse. In those days, Israel lived without a king, and during that time there was a Levite who was living in the mountainous area of Ephraim. This man took a woman from Bethlehem in Judah as his concubine. It is worth noting that while the Levite resided in the northern part of Israel, the woman came from the southern region. After some time, the woman was unfaithful to the Levite and left him, choosing to return to her father's house in Bethlehem, where she remained for approximately 4 months. Upon discovering that she had returned to her father's home, the Levite resolved to set out on a journey to bring her back. He undertook the trip from his home in Ephraim down to Bethlehem in the south, with a firm determination to retrieve her. Upon his arrival, the woman's father received him graciously, extending warm hospitality and kindness. On multiple occasions, the Levite made attempts to depart with his wife, but each time, his father-in-law urged him to remain for just one more night. This back and forth continued for several days, until finally the Levite decided it was time to end his stay and set off. Expressing his gratitude for the hospitality he had received, he departed on the return journey, taking the woman with him. Unfortunately, it is during their journey back that the story takes a devastating and tragic turn as they travel through the region. As they made their way northward from the southern part of Israel, they eventually came near the city of Jebus. The Levite's servant proposed that they stop and spend the night in Jebus, but the Levite declined, expressing a preference to press on to Gibeah. His reasoning was that he anticipated receiving hospitality from fellow Israelites in Gibeah. When they finally reached Gibeah, they were surprised to find that no one extended an offer of shelter, a shocking occurrence considering the strong cultural emphasis on hospitality among the Israelites. As evening fell, an elderly man came upon them in the town square. Upon learning that they had no accommodations for the night, he graciously invited them into his home. The Levite quickly accepted the generous offer, assuring the elderly host that they had their own supplies and required only a space to rest for the night. Once they were settled in the house, it initially appeared that they were safe. However, something dreadful soon occurred. A mob of men from the city gathered around the house, loudly demanding that the Levite be brought out to them so they could subject him to horrific abuse. This act of unspeakable perversion and brutality highlights the moral depravity and corrupt state of the city of Gibeah. In a bizarre and unsettling attempt to placate the men, the host offered them his own daughter along with the Levite's concubine, hoping to protect his guest from harm. When the mob refused this offer, the Levite, in a moment of desperation, gave them his concubine instead. The men subjected the concubine to brutal and continuous abuse throughout the entire night. At daybreak, they finally released her. Gravely injured, she somehow managed to make her way back to the door of the Levite's temporary lodging, where she collapsed in exhaustion and pain by morning. When the Levite opened the door, he found his concubine lying there, her hands outstretched on the threshold of the house. He called out to her, urging her to rise and continue their journey, but she remained silent, giving no response. Tragically, she had succumbed to the injuries and suffering inflicted on her during the night. In a grim and unsettling act, the Levite placed her lifeless body on his donkey and proceeded on the journey back to his home. Upon reaching his home, he made a deeply troubling and shocking decision. He dismembered the woman's body into 12 separate parts, sending each part to a different tribe of Israel, as a stark and horrifying message to highlight the atrocity committed by his fellow Israelites in the tribe of Benjamin. This gruesome act sent shockwaves throughout the entire nation of Israel, stirring widespread alarm and outrage. The tribes were appalled and horrified by the incident, declaring it to be an unprecedented atrocity since the time of their deliverance from Egypt. Outrage and deep confusion gripped the people, leading them to convene and deliberate on how they should respond to such a heinous crime. This horrifying incident triggered a brutal civil war between the tribe of Benjamin and the rest of Israel, ultimately leading to the loss of thousands of lives on both sides. The conflict concluded with the tribe of Benjamin facing near annihilation, leaving behind only 600 surviving men. Confronted with this dire situation, the other tribes grew increasingly alarmed at the prospect of losing one of Israel's tribes entirely. The lack of women for the men of Benjamin to marry and carry on their lineage posed a serious threat to the survival of the tribe. As a result, the tribes collectively devised a controversial and drastic solution. They launched an attack on a particular clan, capturing 400 women and presenting them as wives to the remaining men of Benjamin. Despite this action, there were still 200 men of Benjamin who were left without wives. To address this remaining issue, the Israelites devised yet another highly contentious plan. During an upcoming festival, they permitted the men of Benjamin to abduct women for marriage, a scheme they justified as not technically violating their collective vow to withhold their daughters from the Benjaminites. These events vividly illustrate the profound consequences of poor decision-making and how a single bad choice can set off a chain of equally tragic and misguided actions. The ripple effects of Israel's decisions caused immense suffering to innocent individuals who bore no responsibility for the initial heinous acts that sparked the conflict. Let us now take a moment to reflect on the key lessons we can draw from this sobering and tragic account. The first takeaway is that a lack of accountability and responsibility can easily drive individuals or communities to commit grave and costly errors. The opening verse, which states that there was no king in Israel at that time, serves as a clear indication of how the absence of leadership and accountability paved the way for widespread moral corruption and chaotic behavior among the people. Without a higher authority to hold us accountable, we are often prone to making rash and impulsive decisions without adequately weighing their potential consequences. The second lesson underscores the critical importance of respecting and upholding the dignity of every human being. Acknowledging that all humans bear the image of God, the host's shocking proposal to offer his own daughter and the concubine in place of his guest reflects a tragic underestimation of the inherent value of these women's lives. This grim example serves as a reminder of our duty to honor the intrinsic worth and dignity of every person, resisting any inclination to treat others as objects or deny their humanity. A third key lesson highlights the perilous consequences of drifting away from God and His guidance. Throughout the book of Judges, we observe a gradual moral and spiritual decline in Israel as they consistently stray from God's divine principles. This downward spiral reaches its horrifying climax in the final chapters, vividly demonstrating how estrangement from God can result in actions that are beyond comprehension. The further we distance ourselves from God, the more susceptible we become to falling into grave errors and moral failings. Another important takeaway is that the consequences of poor decisions are unavoidable and frequently have a broader and more far-reaching impact than we might anticipate. While the sin committed by certain members of the tribe of Benjamin was undeniably horrific, the retaliatory actions of the other tribes resulted in the deaths of countless innocent people and immense suffering across the land. Each choice we make carries consequences that often extend beyond our control or initial expectations. Lastly, even amid the chaos, failure, and destruction, we can witness the profound manifestation of God's grace. Despite the devastating repercussions, God enabled the tribe of Benjamin to recover and allowed Israel as a whole to rebuild and restructure itself in the aftermath. The concluding verse of the book of Judges encapsulates the essence of the entire narrative. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Each person did what seemed right in their own eyes. Let us take to heart the significance of our decisions, always remembering that every choice we make carries a lasting and far-reaching weight.